The storm's call. The storm was unrelenting, battering the lonely road with heavy snowflakes that seemed to fall endlessly from the blackened sky. The world around Jessica felt like a painting dipped in shadows, silent, frozen, and eerily still. The air was thick with the biting chill of the night, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and refuses to leave. Everything was muffled by the snow, like the earth itself had been wrapped in a thick, quiet blanket. In the midst of this unforgiving winter landscape, the soft glow of a car's taillights painted a fleeting line across the road. The car sped down the desolate street, disappearing quickly into the haze of snow and darkness, leaving nothing but the cold, still air behind. There was no one around, just the snow, the road, and the quiet hum of the world that seemed to have stopped moving. At the edge of the road, barely visible in the falling snow, stood a lone German shepherd. His coat was covered in ice and dirt, his once vibrant fur now dull and matted from weeks of wandering the streets. His ribs were clearly visible beneath his fur, the harsh reality of hunger and neglect written across his thin frame. He looked like a shadow of the dog he used to be. The dog, whose name was once Orson, though the memory of his past life seemed as distant as the stars above, stood motionless in the middle of the road, his eyes fixed on the vanishing taillights of the car. He was no stranger to pain, to loneliness. He had survived in this harsh world by learning how to fend for himself. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, something was calling to him, and he didn't quite understand what. The biting wind howled around him, cutting through his fur, but it didn't matter. Orson's focus was unbroken. He breathed heavily in the cold air, his breath a cloud of vapor that vanished almost as quickly as it formed. He stood still, as if frozen in time, feeling the weight of the world press down on him. But then, just as he thought the moment would pass, he heard it, a faint sound, almost lost in the roar of the storm, a soft rustle, barely audible. Orson's ears pricked up, and for a moment, he wondered if the wind had tricked him. But then, the sound came again, a whimper, faint and fragile. It was the sound of life, weak and vulnerable, calling out in the storm. His instincts screamed at him to move, to run, to escape whatever danger was waiting. But something in him, the part of him that had once known love, that had once been cared for, pulled him forward instead. He took a cautious step toward the sound, his paws crunching against the icy ground. His body, worn from the long months on the streets, ached with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. The box was there, half buried in the snow, its edges damp and crumbling from the relentless weather. Orson's nose twitched as he approached, and there it was again, the faintest whimper, a weak cry of distress. His body tensed. Something was inside. He took a hesitant step closer, his gaze fixed on the cardboard box. His heart raced as his instincts waged war with his better judgment. What was in there? What had been left to survive in the cold, alone? He pressed his nose against the opening of the box, breathing in deeply. The scent that hit him was faint but unmistakable. It was human, a baby's scent. Orson's body froze as the realization struck him like a lightning bolt. A baby. In the middle of a storm, abandoned in the snow. The baby was barely breathing, its skin pale from the cold, and it lay motionless in the box, wrapped in what little protection the cardboard could offer. Orson's heart pounded in his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt something shift inside him. A protective instinct, something deeper than survival. This little life, so fragile and helpless, needed him. Without thinking, Orson acted. His muscles, weak from the harsh elements and starvation, screamed in protest as he clamped his jaws around the edge of the box, lifting it with every ounce of strength he could muster. His paws slid against the icy ground, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. There was a life in his care now. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark, but he pressed on, dragging the box through the snow, each step a battle against the wind and the cold. His breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of the box felt heavier with every moment. The baby inside remained still, its breath shallow and faint. The snowstorm raged on, but Orson didn't care. His body ached. His strength was waning, but he pushed forward. With every pull of the box, the need to protect, to save this small, helpless creature drove him. For the first time in months, Orson had a purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was saving a life. And nothing in the world was going to stop him from doing that. As he continued on, every inch of his body screamed for rest, but the thought of giving up was impossible. He couldn't. Not when a life, this tiny, fragile life, was depending on him. The struggle for survival. Orson's breath came in ragged, labored gasps as he struggled through the thick, wet snow. His paws, frozen from the biting cold, felt like blocks of ice against the harsh, unyielding ground. The storm had picked up, swirling the snow in chaotic patterns, obscuring the world around him. Visibility was almost non-existent, and the world felt suffocating, as if the snow was trying to swallow everything in its path. Yet, Orson didn't falter. His body screamed in protest with every strained step, but his will was stronger. There was no turning back. He couldn't stop now. The box felt impossibly heavy in his jaws, as if the very weight of responsibility was pressing down on him. His muscles burned, and his legs trembled with the effort of each step. He had been wandering the streets for what felt like forever, surviving on scraps of food and the bitter cold. But this was different. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about protecting something, someone. The fragile, barely breathing bundle in the box. He could hear his own heart pounding in his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the urgency flooding his mind. The baby inside the box remained eerily still, and with every passing second, Orson's anxiety grew. He could smell the baby's warmth, but it was faint, barely there, just a whisper of life amidst the overwhelming chill. His heart clenched. Was the baby still breathing? Was it too late? A sudden gust of wind cut through the air, stinging his eyes and making him stumble. The snow seemed to fall even harder now, the flakes sharp and unrelenting. Orson's breath came out in short bursts, his chest heaving with the effort to keep moving. He was losing strength. His stomach, hollow from hunger, ached with emptiness, but he couldn't think about that. Not now. He needed to focus. He had to keep going. For the baby. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless. Each step felt like it took him farther from safety and deeper into the unforgiving storm. But through the swirling snow, Orson saw a faint light in the distance, a glimmer of hope. It was a street lamp, its glow faint but real, casting a dull light through the blizzard. A street lamp meant people. It meant warmth, shelter, safety. It was the beacon that he had been moving toward, the only thing that promised any hope. His legs shook as he moved closer, the box dragging behind him, refusing to cooperate, resisting every pull. The weight of the cardboard and the baby seemed to grow heavier with every moment. Orson's mind screamed at him to stop, to rest, but his body refused to listen. His paws slid against the icy road, slipping again and again. But he gritted his teeth and pressed on. As he neared the street lamp, his chest tightening with exhaustion, Orson's ears perked up. A faint sound reached him, almost lost beneath the howling wind. A whisper of movement. The sound of footsteps. His heart skipped. Could it be someone? He couldn't be sure, but the sound was real, and it was getting closer. Orson's tired, blurred vision saw a shadow moving toward him through the storm. A figure. It was a man, clad in a thick coat, trudging through the snow with slow, deliberate steps. The man's breath formed clouds of vapor in the cold air, his face obscured by a scarf, but his eyes were locked onto Orson's form, following the path the dog had taken. Orson's heart pounded louder. He wasn't sure what the man would think. He wasn't sure of anything anymore, but he had to believe that this person could help. This was his chance. The box, the baby, it could be saved. But if the man didn't stop, if he turned away, Orson wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. With one last effort, Orson released his grip on the box, letting it drop with a soft thud into the snow. His legs wobbled beneath him, the exhaustion finally catching up. His vision blurred as he swayed, his body betraying him. But he didn't give in. He couldn't. Not now. Not when he had made it this far. He looked up at the man, his tail stiff with cold, his eyes pleading. The wind bit into him, making his fur stick together in ice-crusted clumps. But through the storm, through the blur of cold and fatigue, Orson didn't waver. His gaze met the man's, and in that moment, everything seemed to stop. The world fell away, leaving only Orson and this stranger. The man stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock. He stared at the dog, who was barely standing, trembling against the storm. His breath came out in ragged bursts, his arms hanging loosely by his sides. But his gaze never left Orson. The man seemed to sense something, a quiet urgency, something powerful that the dog was trying to convey. The storm raged around them, but for a moment, it felt like time had slowed. Orson's heart beat erratically as he struggled to stay on his feet. He wasn't sure if he could continue any longer, but he couldn't give up now. The man had to understand. The baby needed help. The man took a cautious step forward, his face still filled with confusion, disbelief. Orson's body trembled violently, his sides heaving with shallow breaths. But he didn't move. Not yet. Not until the man came closer. The man was only a few feet away now, his eyes flicking between the dog and the box in the snow. He seemed to take in the situation, but Orson couldn't understand what he was thinking. He just needed him to help. Orson needed him to see that the baby inside the box was real, that it was alive, just barely. With one final push, Orson summoned all the strength he had left, letting out a desperate bark, weak, ragged, but loud enough for the man to hear. The man's eyes widened, and he froze for a moment, the shock clear on his face. But then something shifted in him. His hands, shaking, slowly reached toward the box. His gloves crunched through the snow as he knelt, pulling back the damp cardboard with trembling fingers. Orson's legs gave way then, his body unable to hold on any longer. He collapsed into the snow, his side pressing against the cold ground. But his eyes never left the man. The man's breath hitched as he looked into the box, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. Inside, the tiny, fragile form of a baby lay motionless, pale, and too still. The realization hit him hard. "Oh God," the man whispered, his voice cracking. He reached inside, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he pulled the baby from the box, his eyes locked onto the tiny, lifeless figure. Orson could barely lift his head, but he had done it. He had brought the baby this far. The man's hands moved quickly now, wrapping the baby in his warm coat, pressing it close to his chest, as if trying to shield it from the cruel, cold storm. Orson, exhausted beyond measure, lay in the snow, his body failing him. But he had done what he needed to do. He had saved a life. As the man pulled out his phone, frantic and desperate, Orson could feel the faint stirrings of peace. It wasn't over yet. The baby had been saved, and he had done everything he could. "Please, hurry," the man pleaded, his voice barely audible through the storm. And just as the man cried for help, Orson's heavy, exhausted body gave in to the cold, his chest rising for the final time. A final plea. The storm continued its relentless assault, the snow swirling violently around them as Orson lay motionless on the icy ground, his body shivering from exhaustion and the cruel bite of the wind. The man, his face pale and lined with shock, still held the baby tightly against his chest, his hands trembling as he dialed his phone. The urgency in his voice was palpable, but even as he shouted into the phone, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the dog that had dragged the baby to safety. Orson's chest heaved with shallow breaths, his body trembling under the weight of the storm, but his spirit was still there. Even in his final moments, he didn't look away. His eyes, tired and glazed, remained fixed on the man, and something in them, a flicker of trust, of purpose, spoke volumes. Orson had done his part, but now the man had to do his. The sound of sirens cut through the night like a distant wail, growing louder as the ambulance neared. Silas, this stranger who had witnessed a dog's last act of selflessness, held the baby close to his chest, not caring about the snow or the cold biting at his face. His eyes kept glancing down at the baby, who was now wrapped in a thick, heated blanket, the infant's tiny body still cold but slowly starting to warm. Silas whispered words of comfort to the child, his breath catching in his throat as he felt the baby's shallow but steady pulse. But Orson's fate remained uncertain. Silas knew he couldn't afford to waste time. He glanced at the collapsed German shepherd one more time, but his heart sank as he saw how motionless the dog had become. The dog had dragged itself through the storm with a devotion that was almost human, a devotion born of a sense of responsibility and an instinctual need to protect. "I'm here, buddy," Silas murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper, the words full of a deep sorrow. "You did it. You saved him." He leaned over, carefully laying the baby in the snow, tucked in tightly in the coat, and rushed to Orson's side. Silas could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. He was a man who had seen death before, too many times in his career, but this was different. This wasn't a person who had passed from the world. It was an animal who had given everything, to save a life. And if Orson passed now, there would be no one left to thank him. No one left to honor the dog's incredible sacrifice. Silas gently cupped his hands around the dog's cold head, lifting it slightly, hoping against hope that there was still some spark of life in him. Orson's fur, frozen and slick with snow, stuck to Silas's gloves, but he didn't care. He could feel the warmth seeping from the dog's body, slowly fading with every breath that Orson took. His chest was barely rising, each breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Hang on," Silas whispered urgently, "just a little longer." His heart was heavy, a knot of guilt tightening in his chest. He hadn't been the one to save the baby. Orson had done that, with no hesitation, no second thoughts. It was instinct, yes, but it was also something more. Orson had sacrificed everything for the chance to protect someone else, and Silas couldn't let that sacrifice be in vain. The sirens were now right on top of them, their bright lights flashing across the snow-covered road, casting eerie red and blue shadows across the landscape. But Silas barely noticed. His focus was entirely on Orson. He could feel the faint pulse in the dog's neck, weak but steady. There was still a flicker of hope, but he wasn't sure how much time they had left. He needed to get Orson help. He needed to save him too. The paramedics arrived quickly, running toward them through the snow, their boots crunching with urgency. One of them, a woman with a thick jacket and a headlamp, knelt beside Orson, immediately assessing the situation. She moved quickly, expertly, applying an oxygen mask over Orson's nose and mouth, the hiss of air filling the night. Silas stepped back, allowing her to work, his hand still trembling from the intensity of the moment. But he couldn't look away. Orson had given everything. He had dragged that box through the storm, had fought against his own exhaustion to save the baby. Could they really let him die now, after everything he had done? The paramedic turned to Silas with a somber expression. "He's suffering from hypothermia, exhaustion, dehydration," she said, her voice calm but with an underlying urgency. "He's too weak to move on his own." Silas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He could feel his body shaking now, the cold seeping deeper into his bones. But it wasn't the cold that shook him. It was the overwhelming realization that this dog, who had endured so much pain and suffering, was now fighting for his life. He couldn't let it end here. He gently placed his hand on Orson's cold side, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke to the dog. "You don't get to give up now, Orson. You've done too much for this little one. You've done too much for me." For a moment, nothing happened. Orson remained still, his body limp, his breath shallow. But then, as if by some miracle, Silas felt a slight twitch under his hand. The dog's body gave a small, almost imperceptible tremor, a flicker of movement that made Silas's heart soar. "Come on, buddy," Silas murmured, leaning in closer. "You're not done yet." He could feel the faintest hint of warmth returning to Orson's body, and his eyes widened in disbelief. The dog's eyes fluttered slightly, and then, ever so slowly, they opened, staring up at Silas with an expression of quiet strength. It wasn't much, just a slight movement, but it was enough. The paramedics continued to work, placing heat pads on Orson's body, trying to stabilize him, but Silas couldn't look away. Orson had fought for this baby's life, and now, just maybe, Silas could help fight for his. He wasn't going to let this dog's incredible courage go unrewarded. Minutes passed like hours as the paramedics worked. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, Orson's breathing became steadier. The shallow gasps that had once punctuated the cold night were now deeper, more deliberate. "We're not out of the woods yet," the paramedic said, looking at Silas. "But I think he's going to make it." Silas let out a shaky breath, his whole body relaxing for the first time since he had found Orson on the road. He had done it. The baby was safe. Orson was safe. The storm raged on. But in that moment, in the midst of the snow and the chaos, there was peace. Orson had saved a life, and in turn, his life had been saved as well. The gift of hope. The storm had finally begun to subside, its fury abating as the wind softened into a gentle breeze. The snow, though still falling, seemed quieter now, more peaceful, as if the earth itself was taking a deep collective breath. Silas stood beside the ambulance, his face pale from exhaustion and cold, but his heart was a little lighter now. Orson, though weak, had shown signs of life. He was still breathing, still hanging on. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics continued to work, their voices a constant hum in the background. They were focused on the baby, who was now stable, wrapped in warm blankets and hooked up to monitors. Every now and then, Silas would glance at the tiny, fragile form of the baby, relieved that the little one had survived. The baby had been so close to death, but thanks to Orson's tireless efforts, the child had been given a second chance. But it wasn't just the baby's life that hung in the balance. Orson's life, too, was teetering on the edge. His breathing had become steadier, but his condition was still critical. The paramedics had administered fluids, heat pads, and oxygen, but there was no guarantee that he would make it. He had given everything to save the baby, and now it seemed like he might not survive himself. As the ambulance continued its trek toward the nearest hospital, Silas sat beside Orson, who was still draped across the gurney, his fur damp and ice-cold. The German shepherd's once shiny coat was now matted and streaked with dirt, but there was something about him that was undeniably strong. Silas could see it in the dog's eyes, the unyielding determination, the loyalty that had carried him through the storm. "You're a fighter, Orson," Silas whispered, his voice raw. "You've earned your rest. Just hang on a little longer. Please." For a brief moment, it felt like the world had paused. The ambulance's sirens cut through the night air, but inside the vehicle, everything was calm, almost surreal. Silas gently placed his hand on Orson's head, feeling the warmth slowly returning to the dog's body. He could sense that the dog was still with him, still holding on. Then, just as the weight of the moment threatened to overwhelm him, a faint sound broke through the silence, a weak but unmistakable sound. A small breathy growl, so faint that Silas wasn't sure if he had imagined it. Orson's eyes flickered open, and though his body was still frail, his gaze locked onto Silas with a glimmer of recognition. The dog's lips quivered as if he was trying to say something, but no words came. Instead, Silas could see the quiet strength in his eyes, the unwavering loyalty that had driven him to save the baby. Orson was alive. He had fought his way through the storm, and now he was fighting for his own life. "You did it, buddy," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved a life, and now we're going to save yours." In that moment, Silas understood. The bond between Orson and the baby was not just a story of survival. It was a story of sacrifice, of hope, and of redemption. Orson had given everything to save someone else, and now, with the same unwavering loyalty, he had given Silas the opportunity to save him. It was a gift of hope. The ambulance pulled into the hospital parking lot, its tires screeching to a halt as paramedics quickly rushed to open the doors. Silas was on his feet before the vehicle even stopped, his hands gently lifting Orson from the gurney. The dog's body was still weak, but there was something different about him now. A spark, a light that had been rekindled. As they rushed through the hospital doors, Silas heard the distant sound of someone calling for help. But this time, it wasn't a call for the baby. It was a call for Orson. The doctors quickly took over, working with an urgency that matched Silas's own. They placed Orson on a new gurney, hooking him up to machines, giving him fluids, and monitoring his vital signs. Minutes turned to hours as Silas sat beside Orson, unable to tear his eyes away. The dog had been through so much, but he had made it. He had done the impossible, dragging the baby through the storm, showing a courage and loyalty that few humans could match. And now he was getting the care he so desperately needed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doctor emerged from the treatment room, her face tired but hopeful. Silas jumped to his feet, his heart racing. "Is he going to be okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor nodded, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "He's a fighter," she said. "We've stabilized him. He's not out of the woods yet, but we're optimistic. He'll need time to recover, but he's made it through the worst of it." Relief flooded Silas's body, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to breathe. Orson was going to make it. Against all odds, he had survived. Over the next few days, Orson's recovery was slow but steady. Silas visited him every day, sitting by his side, offering words of encouragement, and reminding the dog of everything he had done. The bond between them deepened with each passing day. Silas knew that without Orson, the baby wouldn't have survived the storm. And without Orson, he wouldn't have found the hope he had been searching for all along. But Orson wasn't just a hero because he saved a life. He was a hero because he had reminded Silas of the power of loyalty, sacrifice, and love. He had shown him that even in the darkest of storms, there was always hope, always a chance for redemption, and always a reason to fight. Eventually, Orson regained enough strength to leave the hospital, his steps still tentative but filled with purpose. Silas was there to take him home, to give him the safe, warm place he had always deserved. And as they walked out of the hospital together, Orson by his side, Silas couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the dog who had saved not just a life, but also his own. Together, they had survived the storm. Together, they had found hope. And together, they would move forward, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, they had the strength to face it. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.